So welcome. This is a STAN meeting. STAN stands for Sarasota Citizen Action Network. I'm Tom Macrulo, and Susan Shetley and Mike Hutchinson are both members of STAN. STAN started because there were different problems facing different parts of the county. To the east, we have Old Myakka being threatened by Lakewood Ranch. In the center, we have the Celery Fields being threatened by DR Horton. And to the west, we have Benderson taking control of Siesta Key. So before we get to Steve's presentation, which I think you're going to find very interesting, I just want to ask two of our members to give brief updates because that's what we've been doing all year long. So Mike, would you come up and just, Mike Hutchinson is with the Old Myakka group, and here you go.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so out east, the big thing we have going right now is Lakewood Ranch expansion from the end of University down to Fruitville. For the people that have been coming regularly, you'll know that there's a lawsuit to overturn the decision to allow about 5,000 homes. So I was going to give just a quick update on where we're at on that. The final brief from our attorney's been filed with the appellate court in Tampa. We requested to have oral arguments, and we're now waiting for a court date to be set. So once we have that, we'll probably put out a press release. Meanwhile, Lakewood Ranch has gone ahead and did a neighborhood workshop to rezone that. It was Tuesday night, and it was the normal one we have with Lakewood Ranch, which was horrible. Sound was a problem. Everything just didn't click at all. So they're at risk if they go any farther, if they go with the rezone, which they have the right to do if they wish. But right now, they mentioned they would like to go with the planning commission meeting before the end of the year. I don't think a lawsuit will be settled by then. So we'll see what happens.
Well, Susan Shetley here, and following up on what Mike talked about, the neighborhood workshops. Just as a curiosity, I'd like to see the hands of how many people here have attended a Sarasota County neighborhood workshop. Okay, that's pretty good. Some of you may recall, I'm showing my age when I say they used to be in person. And they were much better then. You got much better information, you had more interaction with the developers, consultants. Can you hear me? Yeah. So COVID came along and they switched it to all virtual. And sometimes it works decently with Zoom. Teams rarely works well. Stantec always uses Teams. Stantec does a heck of a lot of development work in Sarasota County. So what we're thinking about doing is we've gone to the county a number of times about this over the last couple of years, saying make them back in person or make them hybrid. Allow people that want to come in person and be able to go up and actually look at the maps and get some information and talk to people. And then also still have the online version for people who maybe live a little too far away or are out of town or can't get there that night. So shortly, there's going to be information put out through Tom's blog or via emails to you with information about contacting county commissioners and yet again asking for them to return to something that is more productive, more informative, and might actually accomplish some of the purposes and goals of the neighborhood workshops. So keep your eyes peeled for that. We're going to be asked, that's going to be scans. One of SCAN's first active duties. So we're going to see how we can do things when we all work together and represent people across the entire county. And I'm not going to spend any more time on that right now, but I'm looking forward to talking with you about it more and very excited to have the presentation we have coming up now.
Thank you, Susan and Mike. So this is just by way of brief introduction of Steve. I've known Steve Suau for several years. I actually encountered him back in the Fruitful Initiative. You probably doesn't remember, but at that time he was an important member of the group that was charrette designing the Fruitful Initiative. He's a man of many interests. He's interested in soil renourishment, in biochar, in composting, and of course in stormwater. He was the first engineer to organize a stormwater department in Sarasota County. And by our good fortune, that led to his working with several other gifted Sarasotans, including Gene Doobie of Audubon and John Thaxton, on the creation of the Celery Fields. What began as stormwater protection at the Celery Fields became one of our county's most valued amenities, a superb birding area and recreational space. Steve can speak to why he decided to do his independent report about the flooding after Hurricane Debby. Hurricanes? Tropical storm?
Tropical Storm.
Okay. What I know is what he's done comes from his deep knowledge of the stormwater systems and land configurations. Had the county commission tried to hire some outside firm to do a study like Steve has done, it would have taken months, it would have cost a bundle, and he did it all on his own, independently, at no charge. We'll be seeing or watching to see how it's received by the county and whether they act on it. And after that, I just want to hand it over to Steve.
So I've been a resident of Sarasota for over 40 years, and I'm an old timer. I've been somewhat retired, or at least trying to retire. And I got a call from Sarasota County. I was involved in the program when they started it back in the 1990s, and worked on the advisory committee, and I was actually the director the last time there was a big flood in Philly Creek in 1992. I don't know if there's folks here that remember that, but I got a call on Friday, would have been August 7th, I think, from Spencer Anderson, the Public Works Director at Sarasota County. And I haven't really been involved with them for 20, 25 years, asking if I would consider doing an independent third-party review of what the flooding was. And he was pretty open, saying, you know, we need to know what happened, if we did some things wrong, we need to know that. And I thought about it over the weekend, and got very intrigued, particularly by some of the severe flooding that happened, because it doesn't make, some of it didn't make sense, to be honest with you. And Laurel Meadows, I was seeing it on the news, for example. And in thinking about it, I realized that something that very unusual might have happened, particularly out here. And I talked to Spencer on Monday, and I said, you know, Spencer, I think there'll be a perception that this is not really independent if I take money from the county, and from your perspective, if you're paying me, the perception might be, well, I'm going to do what the county tells me to do. So I said, you know, I had a water resources consulting firm. I sold it a couple years ago, and I said, I still don't work for free, but I'll do this one because it's important to the community. And Spencer said, well, we will open up and be transparent and give you whatever you need. You can contact staff, and they've been pretty true to that. Anything I've asked for, information, they've been able to get to me. So that's what I'm doing here. I've known Tom and Susan for a while, and they were gracious enough to allow this forum to be used to kind of unveil some of the things. I'm going to talk about the history, the science, and also some working recommendations that I've been noodling with that I think will help move forward. And one of the things I want to again point out is we've had these major floods. 1962, I wasn't here, but I remember seeing the pictures of Hurricane Donna that came through. In 1992, it was a no-name tropical depression that just sat on top of the county for 3 days and dumped between 12 and 16 inches of rain, I think, in Philippi Creek, up to 20 in some areas. And this is from a T-shirt that was very popular at the time. People wore this T-shirt, the front and the back, and they filled the commission chamber, demanding that something be done. At the time, development didn't really extend that far out east. There were a lot of problems in the Pinecraft area. That's been a known problem area that flooded in 1962. It's been there that long. And there were problems in the Colonial Oaks, Colonial Gable area in 1992, just on the west side of the interstate. But from that, some good things happened out of that event. And I want to just mention those real quick because I think that we have an opportunity to reset and get some changes made this time as well. That's the opportunity I think we might have. But of the 92 flood, that's when the county initiated or established their stormwater environmental utility. That is a separate entity, a separate assessment on your tax bill that everybody pays. So revenue to do whatever needs to be done, I would contend, is there. And it's enough revenue where we should all demand that it is state of the art. Money is not the object. The county has the money from their stormwater utility. But that's also what allowed the Celery Fields to be purchased. It was the stormwater utility and that revenue that, once it was set up, the Celery Fields was, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but that was a historical Everglades on a miniature scale. It was drained, but instead of growing sugarcane, they grew celery. Once the soil's depleted, that's when the county purchased it to convert it back into a stormwater holding area. And so that's pretty much what it was purchased for. They also established at the time the most stringent design criteria in the state of Florida. Sarasota County uses a 100-year storm for the design of all the public and private infrastructure. I don't know of any other municipality, even the state of Florida, uses a 25-year. So, and we can talk a little bit more about is that still applicable, but that's, at the time, that was kind of out ahead of everybody. Sarasota County developed very detailed flood hydrodynamic models that can predict flooding on a pretty granular scale to the subdivisions, to the roads, all the ponds are all networked together. And that was, that was 25 years ago when that started. And finally, they established, when I was there, we established an extensive rainfall and water level monitoring program throughout the county, so we know in real time what's happening with rainfall and how high it's getting in the creek. Okay, so the history, let's spend a little bit of time on that. This is a graphic of the official survey of Sarasota County. When Florida became a state in 1845, they had the federal government, the U.S. government land office, surveyed the entire state of Florida. And by 1847, the survey for Sarasota County had been complete. All those squares represent 1 square mile. So the surveyors went out and they surveyed where all those corners were in all those squares. But one of the things that they did when they were out there is if they crossed a waterway, they would map it. If they crossed a wetland on that line, they would map it, but they wouldn't map the wetlands in between. But as a result, when you put that whole checkerboard together, and you don't have a pointer, do you? Okay. So the area over to the east, that's kind of Northport and north of Northport. They really mapped a lot of wetlands over there in a lot of detail. The spine that's kind of running up the middle, that's the Mayaca River. And the spur that comes off to my left, I guess, is Cowpen Slough. Boy, I wish I had a pointer, but I don't know if I can do it on here. Can't see it. But there's the other thing that this reveals is that the creeks that are along the coast were very short. They didn't extend inland very far. They were little tidal creeks. They would come up. Philippi Creek is kind of the long one up there. Goes into kind of an area of marshy area, that's Bobby Jones. There's other marshy areas that represent the Celery Fields at the time. So we have a pretty good idea of what this place looked like 200 years ago, after you look at this stuff long enough. And we didn't really have a lot of drainage. The other historical map, this is the, do you want to dim the lights a little bit, maybe? I don't know if you can see that very well. So in the 1940s,
Steve, I sent a pointer over.
oh, that's your pointer, thanks.
Oh,
Pointer right there.
You always travel with the pointer. Okay.
Yay!
Yeah, so let me just go back real quick. Forward. Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna point out, this is Philippi Creek 200 years ago. It kind of came up, it was a little tidal creek, it meandered, got very small and shallow, and would have stopped right around Bobby Jones, where Bobby Jones golf course is. That again was a big marsh at the time. This is the Celery Fields 200 years ago. This is another big marshy area that we'll talk about. I almost call it the Eastern Celery Fields, but instead of the county purchasing that to store water, homes got built. This is Cowpen Slough, this is the Malaca River, and this is Alligator Creek and Shackett Creek and South Creek. So all these little creek systems here. The other historical map, and I apologize if this is not easy to see, but what happened was the federal government, the Soil Conservation Service at the time, mapped all of the soil types in the county from reports and whatnot. And this is the composite of it. What I've done is I've color-coded the soils that are indicative of wetlands and streams in blue. So that's basically the area where water would be normally during the summer. And again, this is the Celery Fields. This is the area east of the Celery Fields. It's a marsh. This is Cowpen Slough, the Malaca River, and then all the Northport over here. A lot of the marshy area north of Northport. And finally, this is what we call a LiDAR map. This is a fairly recent technology where they're able to map the general topography of the lay of the land, if you will. So the darker the blue, the lower the land in these water courses. Again, the Malaca River corridor. But as it gets yellow and brown and very dark brown, the ground is coming up. So if you wanted to live in the highest part of Sarasota County, where would you live?
Northeast.
The city's Wellfield.
Yes, in the city's Wellfield. That's where they're Wellfield. But you can see, and so this is Philippi Creek Valley here. In the topography, this is the Celery Fields here. But you can see that the land is generally higher in North County than it is in South. As you go south, the land starts to generally be much lower. Okay, so we're going to look at Philippi Creek in this context a little bit. This is a map that overlays the survey with the soil maps. These are two historic signatures, and when you do this, what I found, they match up and confirm each other pretty well. So the red boundary that you see is the boundary of the Philippi Creek or Sarasota Bay watershed, but mainly Philippi Creek as it exists today. Not as much land we'll see drained to Philippi Creek historically, but again, here is the Celery Fields area, here's the other area, big marsh area to the east, and again, it was a sawgrass marsh historically. You can see Philippi Creek again, Bobby Jones, but a lot of these blue areas, the soil maps indicate as being water, so does the survey with all these hash marks. So what happened 100 years ago, fast forward 100 years, Sarasota as well as the state of Florida were obsessed with what they called land reclamation, which was draining the swamp. 100 years ago, everybody was reclaiming land by draining the wetlands. And so in Philippi Creek, what happened was they actually set up a drainage district called the Sarasota Fruitfield Drainage District, primarily for agriculture, to be able to get on the land to grow things. And they incised and deepened Philippi Creek, straightened it out, and then extended it into the reaches to connect all the blue dots, basically, to get all the wetlands to start draining them. This is, again, the Celery Fields and the swamp to the east. This is the big canal that they extended Philippi Creek called Main A. For reference, the interstate now runs through here, right about through here. And they extended this big Main A canal out past over the ridge called Tatum Ridge. So if you think about it, Tatum Ridge, Bee Ridge, Lockwood Ridge, those road names are all indicative that historically they were built on the high ground. They were built on a ridge, it was known. But they extended this canal across the ridge into the swamp to pull that water to the west and into Philippi Creek from Cowpen Slough. So they could grow vegetables there and whatnot. This straight line here, this red line here that's the ridge line, became a dike to block the water from the east, from Cowpen Slough from coming in. They took in water on the west side of the line, but they wanted to keep water on the east side from coming in. And this is what Main A, this was actually the construction of Main A. You can see how significant that was at the time. So when you see these canals out there, they were constructed about 100 years ago, and they were serious about it. This aerial is from 1969, so it shows those two big marshy areas, and they're in agriculture now. And then they were also cutting Cowpen Slough. They were draining Cowpen Slough. That's almost fresh canals here. They started that in the late 60s to pull that water south into Donna Bay. But the rest of it went west and into Philippi Creek under land reclamation. Okay, so one of the things that the county has had now for 25 years are maps of the entire county that show where the floodplain is. This is not an unknown. It is not, in my experience, it's not really easy for the public to access that information. That's something that we need to see change. But they have everything mapped, and they've had it. This is a map of the floodplain as determined for Philippi Creek, this area here, and for this part of Cowpen Slough as it runs along the east side here. And again, this is the two circles I keep coming back to, the Celery Fields and kind of the eastern swamp. But you can see all this floodplain to the east of the dike. That's over in High Hat Ranch, but it's a significant floodplain. And this dike keeps the water from this flows south. It's not supposed to flow to the west. Computer models are great, but my favorite saying is all models are wrong, some are useful. And what that means is no model is perfect, but they can be useful. And I think that the county's models have been useful, but they're not perfect. This is the Philippi Creek Basin. All of these red dots are locations where flood elevations or water elevations are computed every second of the simulation. And what we're really interested in is what's the peak, how high did they get? Those typically correspond to segments in a drainage way or ditch, or a stormwater pond. All the stormwater ponds are in this model. All the wetlands are in this model. All the floodplains are in this model. All the canals and ditches are in this model. And they're connected by either channel links or pipes or bridges, things that move water from one location to another. And there's also a drainage basin, the sub-basin, if you will, around each one of those red dots. So each one of those red dots is taking in water as you simulate the storm. This floodplain is what is predicted as the floodplain for that 10 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. That's what the county uses, that's what FEMA uses for the 100-year floodplain. And so for that scenario, the model is pretty good. It gets down to, or pretty useful, I should say, and it can get down pretty granular into a subdivision and show which homes are flooded or which streets are flooded and which aren't. So it'd be really great if this information was probably more available, because I think there would be a lot of interest for people to be able to access it. Okay, some of the science around Debby in particular. I had mentioned that Sarasota County has a rainfall network. They have gauges throughout the county that are measuring rainfall, and it's not just a gauge like you put in your backyard that can overflow. It actually measures, it's a tipping gauge, so it's always measuring water every, I think 15 minutes or more frequently if it falls more intensely. And within the Philippi Creek Basin area, we looked at, I think it was about 18 different gauges that exist, so we get a good spread of them. And it turns out Manatee County has a pretty good network too, so we actually looked at about 8 gauges up north and east of Philippi Creek in Manatee County, and the USGS has a gauge. So once we did all that, we could draw isobars of how much rain fell where. And for the most part, the highest rain fell out east and north in this area. And it averaged about 13.2 inches over a 3-day period. It was a little bit more some places, a little bit less in other places. We also looked at how that rain was distributed. How intense was it? And so by unit, now, I don't want to, basically we compared the distribution of the rainfall at each gauge. And what we saw was it was pretty consistent. So we looked at it over a 3-day period, but it's divided by 72, so everything is in units of 1, so we can kind of compare apples to apples. But in the first day, which is about here, you had about 10% of the rain falling, and on the last day, which is about here, you had maybe ½ an inch falling. So about 83% of the rain fell in that middle 24 hours. For about 11 inches. So that's more than the county's design storm in one day, but it was also more rainfall overall over a 3-day period. And hopefully this is the last complicated graphic, but the blue and the orange lines are typical of what happened in Debby from 2 of the sites, and that's how the rain was distributed. Over time. The green is the intensity distribution that the design storm uses over 24 hours. And you can see what's interesting, it's very steep. It's very intense. It assumes a very intense rainfall occurs. It's a shorter period, but when it does happen, it's very intense. And the intent, I think, of doing that is in urban areas that will flood things because the infrastructure maybe can't take it quite as fast. So you may get some temporary flooding in streets and whatnot when you get rainfall that intense, which can happen. Okay, so what I looked at then was comparing this 100-year storm to Debby. Debby was more rainfall. It may not have been quite as intense at times. And what we saw, and then we compared the two, and then we looked at if a location, if the 100-year storm was higher, it's a green dot. If Debby was higher, it's a red dot. So it's a mismatch. You can see in a lot of locations, Debby resulted in flood stages, I think as much as over a little over a foot higher than this 100-year storm. And those generally happen in low-lying areas. This is the Celery Fields, this is the Philippi Valley, this is the other area out east, in the Cowpen Slough, very sluggish. So if it was in a low-lying area, typically the more rain that fell, the higher the flood level. The green areas are indicating that those areas are peak sensitive. They probably would be, they're higher probably for the design storm because of that intensity in rainfall that assumes. But this is interesting to me because it's indicating that those red areas may be areas that we ought to be really looking at carefully in the future because they are volume sensitive to the rainfall. And then it's also possible to compare at those monitoring stations where the county's measuring the water level to what the model says. Not just at the peak, but for the entire duration of the storm. And this is pretty typically what we saw. That if Debby, the water level was higher, it was wetter when the storm started. We matched typically the peak and the timing of it pretty closely, but then Debby, because there was more water involved, was slower to recede. That's pretty typically to what we saw when we made the comparison. But I want to point out two other graphs. This is one, there were a couple arm stations where obviously, which is this dark blue, the station went awry. Something happened, the data looked really good up to a certain point, and then it just, something hit it or collapsed it or whatever. So that's something that can happen too in these large storms. And then finally, this is actually a gauge in Manatee County in Upper Cowpen Slough. So this matched really well. This is probably the best one, but this is telling us what the model is saying for Cowpen Slough is pretty accurate, based upon this comparison. Okay, and then I just wanted to touch on two other things that have been somewhat of anomalies for this Debby storm that I saw was Laurel Meadows, as I mentioned, and then areas adjacent to the Celery Fields. These two areas experienced even greater flooding than expected or predicted. Why? With respect to the Celery Fields, it was the operation of a structure. The county is able to close a structure that's located downstream of the Celery Fields in here and basically back water up into the Celery Fields and around it. So the Celery Fields comes up, but it can also start to impact private properties in that industrial area along the interstate, and in fact did. Now, the reason they do that normally is to reduce flooding downstream. And so this whole area here is where flood levels went down as a result of them doing that. The balance was about 9 inches to 12 inches higher than would be expected, where the red dots are, and about 3 to 4 inches lower downstream. But it was basically a man manipulation of the water and not letting it out that caused the water to increase in and around the Celery Fields. For Laurel Meadows, and this was the real puzzler, but over the weekend after Spencer called me and I saw on the news what was happening out there, I got to thinking that something was putting a lot of water in here. And I hypothesized that I looked, and the flood levels over on this side in Cowpen Slough, this is on the east side of this is kind of the Philippi Creek dike, ridge line, are several feet higher than they are in Philippi Creek side. So I hypothesized that somewhere, somehow that dike had been breached. And water will seek a level. If it's higher over here, it's going to flow through that breach. And once it gets through it, it's going to drain up through this way over Delft Road and then make a straight byline for the ditch and where Laurel Meadows is. I advised the county, I talked to Spencer on Monday, and they were looking at pipes being restricted downstream. And I gave him this hypothesis. And about a week later, YouTube is great in this day. People can post anything. And I just randomly ran across someone who I subsequently talked to a little bit, or communicated with, had posted some drone footage and of the flooding out in that area. And one of the most revealing things was, this is Delft Road, and it says heading west. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is the white line of the pavement. There's several inches of water that have gotten up over this road, and it's falling. It's like rippling over this road, and it's 100 feet or more stretch. I communicated with the individual who took this excellent video, and he said this was on Wednesday morning, so this is after all the rain stopped. And this is kind of what people were saying is flood levels started coming up after the rain stopped. So I realized that's right here, okay? And I realized if there was a breach, it had to be south of there, along here, somewhere. And so the county called me, they said, we're gonna go out and look for that breach. And I told them, go out to the end of Delft Road and just go south. And it's gotta be down there somewhere. By the end of the day, they found it, and they sent me a little video of it, and it was right down in this area here. Now this is that LiDAR that I mentioned that kind of looks at, this is from 2018, I think, and it's shown that it's been there for a little while, about 5 or 6 years. And when I looked at the video, you could see that it was like Brazilian peppers and woody plants that were in the breach. So it wasn't clean. Stuff had been growing up in it, but there was no foliage, no leaves or anything on the plants. The water had indicating that they'd probably been washed out by the water. And the other unique thing was there wasn't any understory, any grass or anything on the bottom. It was all sand. Okay, so it was indicating that something a lot of water had flown through there, but there was no, but it had been there a while, for several years. So that was a hypothesis. Once this breach was discovered with this video, it kind of confirmed it, and then it was a matter of going back and being able to simulate that with the model. And that took some time, but the model is wrong until it can predict what happened in reality. And we were finally able to simulate exactly what happened and hit the high water marks that had been surveyed in this area. I told the county, and they accommodated. I said, please go out and survey the center line of this road and the top of the dike and the breach all the way down so that we have the exact survey information that we can utilize and model it. And they did it within a couple days. The good news is, if you live in Laurel Meadows, that breach has been fixed. It was fixed before Helena. So they felt, of course, a sense of urgency once they found it to get out there and get this all cleaned up and get that filled in. So that's what happened out there anyway, we believe. So where do we go from here? I'd like to walk through some of my draft kind of recommendations I've been noodling, and then maybe take some questions and get other input if folks have some other ideas. So there's only about 7 or 8 recommendations, and I'll go through these quickly. Some of them are kind of policy and some are operational. First and foremost, we should expect a state-of-the-art floodplain stormwater management in this county. And there's been just a loss of staff. I think there's been an over-reliance on consultants, just subbing out work to high-paid consultants out of town. I would suggest that Sarasota County should build up their stormwater department with people that are very competent, technically proficient in these things, so that they had the internal capacity to do this kind of work again and be less reliant on consultants. You need consultants for some things, but staff's got to be the knowledge base of what to do and how to direct them. The second one, and yeah, I really like this one. So I believe, and I've always believed, that the county should be more protective of these flood-prone areas. Okay, this is just planning 101. They should be identified, and they all are. They've been identified for 25 years. So they should then be prioritized, and the stormwater utility could partner with, who bought the Celery Fields. That's the model. They've already done this type of thing. But we also are fortunate to have the Environmental Sensitive Lands Protection Program. I don't know yeah, a lot of people are familiar with it. I know John O'Miller been the chair forever. You can talk to John. But this is a program that buys land for protection. And when they buy land that contains floodplain, there's a double win. And the county we all get a credit on our insurance bill from FEMA if the county puts these floodplains in public ownership. So there's a lot of incentives to do this. And the Celery Fields was a good model for it. But it turns out that on the current environment sensitive lands map, there is a priority protection site called Fruitville Flatwoods. This is that floodplain east of the dike on High Hat Ranch. Jono, correct me if I'm wrong, but in order for that to be on the map, 2 things have to happen. It has to be eligible, it has to meet the criteria to be eligible for protection, and there has to be an indication that the owner is willing to sell.
All right, at least have a conversation with the county.
Okay.
That doesn't
Or,
mean
yeah,
it's on
or
the market, but
they're willing to entertain a
consider
conversation.
something, yeah.
Yeah. So I showed this to stormwater staff on Monday and said, this is something that ought to really be a focus, because that is a really significant floodplain. It's a lot of it's native habitat, so that's why it meets the criteria. It probably shouldn't be developed, or probably won't be developed, it's probably part of the greenway, but the best thing is to put it in public ownership. But this could happen countywide. These areas could be identified and protected so that they're not built in. Because the backup plan is, from a policy standpoint, the commission, I think we need to be much more careful in increasing density in flood-prone areas. For too long, there's been this notion, well, we have these computer models and the development code, that'll take care of it. And that's not fair. So I would suggest that I've developed additional criteria, but basically, if a site comes in that has significant floodplain in it, in some cases it could be 100%, in some cases it'd be 50%, but in general, we need to stay out of those areas. And if we're going to encroach into them, there needs to be much more review before it can get rezoned. Okay. Spencer Anderson, when he presented to the board, he had a graphic that showed where all the problem areas they had were, and then he overlaid it on the floodplain, and they were all in flood-prone areas. So, I mean, it's just planning 101, try to stay out of the floodplain area. And then the other policy thing, there's already been a lot of discussion on this in Sarasota County with the commission. I've heard it in Manatee County as well. Do we need to update the design criteria? We're having these storms more often, they're a higher volume. Are they right? Well, the fact of the matter is that the criteria that we're using was developed based on data through 1996. So it's already, what, 29 years out of date, okay? There have been a lot of supplemental studies since then, and the USGS has done a study for Florida that has been adopted by the South Florida Water Management District. So the work has kind of already been done. The USGS actually didn't just, so you determine these design storms by looking at what really happened over a period of time. And understand that right now, we stop at 1996. We're not considering what's happened since then, and we've got a lot more data, a lot more years that need to be brought into that evaluation. That's what the USGS did. This was published in 2022 anyway. Plus, they looked at the trend into the future. Because if we're going to be designing infrastructure, be it public or private, into the future, it ought to be considering what might happen 20 years from now. That's what it's expected to last for. So the USGS did that. The South Florida Water Management District has adopted multiplication factors. Basically, it's about 20, I think it's anywhere from 15 to 30% increase in the rainfall that they're recommending. So this is a conversation that's already underway. Fortunately, a lot of the analysis and work has been done and can be relied on for that. I want to finish by talking about the operation of the utility, basically making it more transparent. What I've heard a lot of from a lot of folks I've talked to is at least a perception that Sarasota County is not maintaining their drainage system. And let's see if I can get this to work. So it turns out that they do have an inventory of all of their drainage. That's going to come up on the screen. They have a link. You can write down ArcGIS.com stormwater management map. That map has the entire drainage system, and it's it's color coded by what type it is and when they maintain it, or when they're supposed to maintain it. There's also 200 hotspots identified in that map, which are areas that they are within 24 to 74 hours before a storm, they have to go out and inspect and take action if necessary. So making this data more available to the public, and I would even, and I can't get this to move forward, let me just see one more time. Yeah, I'll make this link available to Tom. So I don't know why, but it's not letting me forward. But I'll wrap up anyway. So there's, yeah, I think that the county stormwater ought to have annual meetings with the different, there's 5 different regions in this county or watersheds, with community leaders in those areas to go over what's on the maintenance routine for that year and to review these hotspots, because the community might have new hotspots that need to be considered, okay? So I think that would be important. And I'll just kind of end there. I think that willing to take any questions and any input from folks, but I think this is really an opportunity, and I've met with staff, they seem receptive, that we need to be looking at making some changes, to use this to make some improvements in their system. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I didn't really mention this, but I don't think you can ignore the fact of all those South Florida slash pines being removed for miles up and down the I-75 5 or 6 years ago. The palmettos, the stable palms, the pines, and all through Northport, large tracts of mostly pine and palmetto are removed, and buildings put in their place, and I think that it makes a big difference.
Yeah, changing the landscape. You know, I honestly, this is a pet peeve too. I don't really understand the development model. We need to change this notion of, and as a soil biologist, clearing decades of life being built in the soil. Decades, century of life being built, hauling it away or burning it, and all that CO2 released. Then digging ponds that is just benign sand, pulling it up, compacting it, and then wonder why you have to apply fertilizer and water to get stuff to grow in that. So I've seen some developers now start to at least salvage that topsoil material to reuse. But a model that would do less, and it used to be that way when I first moved here. People didn't have to clear the trees. There was a different way to design things with lower water levels in lakes. That's really the benchmark. So you didn't have to add all that fill. And if you drive in a subdivision, I'm trying to think, Calusa Lakes is one, you'll see mature trees everywhere. And you don't in the newer stuff since then. It's because of the change in regulations from the Water Management District. But that's a worthwhile discussion to have again. Jono?
So Steve, you mentioned, or talked to us about the dike that separates Philippi Creek from the Cowpen Slough. But there's a dike at Hidden River that's been breached and flooded Hidden River. There's a dike on Upper Maca Lake that's got a breach and threatens Maca Valley ranches. There are all these dikes at various heights around the county. Presumably the county's inventoried those, but whose responsibility is it to maintain those dikes and keep water on whichever side it's supposed to stay?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was the last slide.
Sorry.
That I wouldn't get to was the recommendation to inventory.
Oh, there you go.
Inventory all of those, and yeah, Hidden River is another one that determine who owns it, who's responsible to maintain it, and require it to be inspected and certified every year, okay? South Florida Water Management District already has a program to do that for agriculture. Agriculture down in South Florida, their stormwater ponds all have little dikes around them, 3-4 feet high. They're called above ground impoundments. And they pump into them, but that water management district requires hundreds of those to be inspected and certified to them every year. So we don't have to recreate the wheel. The inspection form's already there. But yeah, I agree 100%. Those are, you know, they can, like I said, they, you know, if you're behind a dike, you're susceptible to unexpected and potential extreme flooding. And we've seen that several times. Bill?
I'd just like to remind everybody that you brought up the point about the increasing density and intensity out in the county. And because of the Citizens for Sensible Growth Charter amendments in 2007, it does require a 4-to-1 vote of the county commission to increase density or intensity in the comprehensive plan. So elections count, and 2 votes on the county commission who didn't just who rubber stamps could slow down the granting of all these comp plan amendments that allow the stuff that Mike Hutchinson was concerned about out around the East County. So on November 5th, think about your county commission votes, because we need 2.
We have political announcement.
I didn't mention any names, Steve. No names.
Yes, ma'am.
Related question. First off, thank you for a fantastic presentation and a really enlightening study. My question is, I'm excited to hear that staff are receptive to this. Is this going to be presented to the county commissioners?
So what I was told was they are going to be having a updated presentation in January. And we will have a few new commissioners at that time, one way or another. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Calusa Lake specifically, the oak trees. I actually live there. And we had 5 days of flooding up to 2 feet. It's never happened before. And-
Yes, it has.
And, it happened, but not 5 feet, not 2 feet, and only lasted 1 or 2 days. This thing lasted 4 days and it got to 2 feet. How come?
Yeah, so Calusa Lakes, because they didn't add fill, that's the flip side of clearing everything. They didn't add fill. The design did not consider the elevation of the waterway they discharge into being so high. So the water actually backs up into Calusa Lakes. I've been around a long time. I remember when that subdivision first went in, and it was a huge problem. And I actually worked with them to help build a bypass canal along I-75, which I noticed had gotten really overgrown. I drove out and down it a couple weeks ago. But there is a way to give relief to that area when it gets up high in a canal along the interstate that was built. It just needs to be cleaned out. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, you had mentioned earlier that the Pinecraft area has always been a problem. Is that because of the water? Our neighborhood was near there and flooded for the first time since the Celery Fields was developed. And we're just wondering, like, can we expect that to happen again? Or is fixing that?
So, Pinecraft is one of the older communities that we have. And so when it was built, like I think in the 50s or 60s, when we had the big flood in '62, it was pretty tragic. So it was built in an old low area, historical low area again. And after 1992, some of the homes were purchased along the canal, and the county put in a dike, they put in a pump. At the time, I wasn't really involved, but I was trying to convince them they should just probably buy more homes if it was cheaper to do that. But that area is always going to be susceptible. And I think that the data, that's one of the data spots, by the way, where the county's measurements are so suspect. I think the flood got much higher than what their instrumentation is saying at that location. It was bad. And it's always going to be susceptible. The dike and the pump that were installed will work up to a point, but once it gets over the dike, over Bay Vista, it can't pump against itself, and that's what I'm saying. I'm sorry. Yeah, Charles.
Question I've got is these recommendations seem really good and really something that ought to be done. But what I'm looking for is not a political answer, but the realistic assessment. Is the county commissioners going to accept this as they currently construed, or are they going to go hell-bent for development? And I'm looking for a realistic response, not a political response. I want to know what their thinking is. Will they accept these types of things?
Well, I mean, I'm not a politician.
Not asking for political.
Yeah.
I'm asking for what the reality is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, after the 62 flood, or 92 flood, significant changes occurred. And I just don't, I mean, let me tell you, for Sarasota County stormwater staff to call Steve Suau after this flood tells me they know something. They need to, something needs to change, okay? I'm going to submit these recommendations to the county. I wanted to, and I'm gonna do all I can to disseminate them over the next 30 days to the community. You guys can help make that change, honestly. I'll tell you what the other thing is. I've talked to some of the incoming commissioners one way or the other, and some of the existing ones. There's enough advocacy, I believe, on the commissioners, with the commissioners to do this. Are 3 votes there yet? I don't know, but I'm working on it. And I think that, you know, they've already been having some of these discussions, like changing the design rainfall event. I think that's pretty low-hanging fruit for them. But these others, I think, are not really that difficult. And guys, you all pay a stormwater fee every year. Every one of you, for years, all your communities. Demand that you get the best out of that. Demand that you get state-of-the-art stormwater. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this is a little off track maybe, but what is the impact of the stormwater on our aquifers? And as we're developing and adding more irrigation wells and the new projected planned developments, how is this all gonna play in together with runoff and?
Well, for the most part, wells are not used in Sarasota County. I mean, they can be used for irrigation in some areas, for your individual lots. But we get our water primarily from either the Peace River, which is surface water, or the Carlton, which is groundwater way out east.
So I live in Mac Valley Ranches. and
Yeah, so that would be.
Told that the HYY Ranch, every homeowner will be promised an irrigation well.
Really?
Yeah,
Well, they should be using reclaimed water or surface water. I would.
so that's something to
Yeah.
think about and all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, in my experience, in the last 20 years, almost all the developments that have gone in, especially the large ones, have been required to use treated reclaimed water for irrigation. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. The area near Laurel Meadows, the intersection of Lorraine Road and Palmer Boulevard and west was also like totally flooded. Palmer Lake, the street we live on, couldn't get up for 4 days. Was that also because of the breach in the dike?
Yeah, that water, see, Laurel Meadows is sitting relatively lower than everything else, so they saw the worst of it, but yeah, it would have impacted them.
Okay. And also a couple of rumors, but just to put this to rest.
Yeah.
You hear things, people say things, one is, did the release of water from Lake Manatee have anything at all to do with flooding in Sarasota?
I'm glad you asked that. No, absolutely
I
not.
suspected not, but how do you tell somebody if you don't know?
Yeah, no, that LiDAR map I showed you it's downstream. It's in another watershed.
Yeah, I was.
But I've heard that too, and I meant to dispel that.
Well, thank you. I would have been amazed if that did impact us. The last one I have is, was there a stormwater drain, at least one or more, that had been found to be, like 80–90% clogged with debris? That was one of the things I heard.
I don't know about.
Oh, okay.
I do know that the county found an old structure in the canal upstream of the Palmer crossing of Main A. Probably was put in there to hold water. They could put boards in, I think. It's an old
Like
concrete
wood,
structure.
that's what I.
Yeah, and they're gonna remove it. It doesn't need to be there anymore, and they said vegetation was getting matted against it and blocking
And
things.
what are those dikes made of? Where they have the dikes?
Earth.
They're earthen dikes. Oh, okay. Anyway, Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Two things. One is it looked like maybe you hadn't gotten through all your recommendations. It looked like there's another slide.
Close enough.
Okay. And then one thing on related to the question of a few people ago. most of the development out east is being required to use reclaimed waters. However, they have not typically been required to cap their wells. And in fact, they use the wells to top up their stormwater ponds, so they're pretty lakes for people. So they actually do still draw from groundwater to top up their lakes during the dry season. So there is still an impact, I think, more than there should be.
Yeah, they'll supplement the lake, you're right. Yeah. Usually with the community well like that. Somebody way in the back.
I want to thank everybody for signing the Debby petition. I kind of think that the commissioners had their eyes open with the petition and felt more open to, doing this. The hydrology study, and the other parts of the other two parts of it. And they're still open to talking about all of this. So they actually hired more staff for doing the lifts, monitoring the lift station. So, the power of the people, I think, has kind of played out a bit in this one. And I thank you so much for signing it.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Right there.
A quick question. There was a report done on Cowpen Slough Basin, and in the report, they said there were supposed to be 5 weirs, of which 3 were built and 1 failed before the report was issued, so there are only 2 existing. Can you tell me what the implications of that are?
Yeah, so you're going way back. So, yeah, that was the Soil Conservation Service back in the Drain the Swamp era, in the 60s and 70s. They came in and they dug a big canal to drain Cowpen Slough in the swamp. It was supposed to go all the way up into Manatee County and have 5 structures. What happened was that water that used to go to Maca River, that canal diverted it to Shackett Creek and Donna Bay and Venice Jetty. And the people down there saw all their oysters getting wiped out. The environment just got obliterated with all that fresh water, and they stopped it, okay? Now the damage was already done, but the canal got built up to about High Hat, and then it got stopped. And so you're exactly right, the 2 structures downstream got built and are still operational. The 3rd one has never worked. It's always been washed out, probably because of all that water that's being stacked up there. And the other 2 didn't build. But that was an old work program by the Soil Conservation Service.
Okay, it hadn't
For
been-
agriculture, it was done for basically agriculture.
So then the other question is, the stormwater management plan was updated in '24, June of this year.
Okay?
Did they take into consideration, I mean, it was done just before Debby happened, or at least it was issued, I don't know when it was done. Did that have, I mean, as you review it, has that been an effective plan? Is that an effective plan going forward?
I don't know. I don't know about that. The last involvement I had with Cowpen Slough was when I was with the county. We purchased the Albritton tract, because that's where the slough was, and we were gonna put water back, it's just like the Celery Fields, okay? But nobody knows about it. And then we purchased a shell and sand mining operation that was finishing up, leased it back to them to finish, but now the county owns the reservoir to store water in. So the idea was to start diverting some of that water back into the sloughs and swamps and let some go back to the Maca River to start restabilizing the oyster population that got wiped out decades ago.
The plan I'm talking about is for this entire county. The Sarasota Storm Management Plan
Oh, I don't know.
was rewritten and issued in June of '24.
Oh, yeah, the regulations, I think it was the regulatory stuff.
Did that take into account any of the recommendations that you're making?
Well, no, that would have been before all this.
But only
I mean, it did make some improvements, but listen, honestly, I've thought for the last several years that the county probably didn't realize what was gonna happen if they get a lot of rain. Hurricane Ian flooded Norfolk. And it resulted in the highest flood stages on record in the Maca River and the Peace River. And those records go back to the 1930s by the USGS. For them, that was as severe or more severe than Debby. But Philippi Creek didn't get that type of flooding. There was some. Why? Because they got more rainfall over there, okay? They didn't, but Northport didn't flood like they did in Debby because that rainfall, we got it over in Philippi Creek this time. So That's the other thing about these big rainfall events is they're kind of fickle on where they happen. Yes, sir, in the red.
I live over on Bowling Road, and we flooded a number of times over the past couple of years. We drained the Filthy Creek, and it's not because of that ditch that, I'm sorry, it's not because of that dike that was breached or Debbie. And we were always told that there's a valve over by Celery Fields that they can open, and when they do, all of a sudden the water recedes. Is that weird scene? And are we going to be doing anything about that?
I don't think that closing that weir would raise flood levels that far upstream. It's mainly limited to the Celery Fields and the areas around it, the industrial area, maybe big cat habitat, and some of those areas in there. But when they close it, that's when it starts backing up. When they open it, it starts letting it back out.
Right, we flood and we complain, they say that you're gonna open it up, and all of a sudden.
It will come up, so maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, it's happened a couple times a year for the past couple of years.
Yeah, so I didn't get into the real detail, but I also am wondering if closing that weir really is worth the effort. And I think the county needs to look at, is that really providing value or not? Because it's causing some impacts upstream clearly as well. And so it may be that that's something that they shouldn't even be playing around with.
Okay.
Let me just, real quick comment, reinforcing what he's saying. All of that Delft Road water that we talk about comes right through our lakes into the Philippi Creek distribution system. And almost instantaneously, with the opening of that weir in Celery Fields, you could see our lakes start to drop and start to see Lorraine Road dry up.
And your lakes are where?
We're across the street from Laurel Meadows.
Okay.
And all of that Delft Road water flows right through our lakes back through Celery Fields.
Okay, so maybe it does have an impact that far upstream. Yes, sir.
So I'm surprised no one has asked this question, but you said Laurel Meadows is clearly the low point in a large area. And it sounds like even without an event like this dike breach, if there's a large amount of rain, it could still flood again. You know, if it's 25 inches instead of 15. Do you believe that's the case? Because it's a large bowl and it's a bottom of it.
I do not. And you can check this for yourself. Ian did drop quite a bit of rain. And Google Earth flew our area on September 29th, 2022, right after. And look at that area. What you'll see is Laurel Meadows has water in their streets, okay, in different clusters. And I went to the plans, and believe it or not, the engineer designed it that way, to flood up to a foot. And by the way, the person that asked about the master plan, the stormwater, that's something that they changed. People cannot use streets as their flood storage. That was never intended to be the case, but people were able to interpret they could flood their streets up to a foot, and some engineers did that. So in any profession, you've got engineers that wouldn't do that, but some that might. And they were so desperate to get storage there because they were in a floodplain that they designed. And you can see it on Google Earth, like I said, you can actually visually see that that's what happened. Yes, sir.
You have all this water coming over the dike from the slough into the area next to Laurel Meadows. And the Laurel Meadows outfall to their dike goes under Lorraine Road, and that was blocked. I wonder what the impact of that, whether if it had been cleared, could some of that water have been taken off?
Maybe, but it was so much water. It's so much water.
It's going to overwhelm it no matter what.
And the fact that it happened a day into 2 days after the rain stopped, it was just a lot of water that got through. Hold on. Lady in the back there in the black.
Yes, hi. I live in the lakes, and historically, I've been in the lakes since 2011, but historically, it has flooded in the past. So they came in, and there's a creek that runs in the middle of the neighborhood, and they dredged that out years ago, and that helped with the flooding in the neighborhood. So people that have lived there since the 80s have said they have not ever seen flooding, as we've all have been saying. They have not seen flooding like this to this extent. My house flooded, probably 3/4 of the homes in the lakes flooded as well. And I'm just curious if you can offer your thoughts on why you
Yeah,
think that they may
that's the
have
lakes
happened.
over on Bay of Vista.
Bay of Vista and,
Yeah.
and I know somebody had mentioned Pine Trap before, but we're a little,
No,
away
yeah,
from
it's a
that.
different location. It's a newer stuff, it's more recent than that, built in probably the 1880s. Yeah, it was built in a low area. It was built in a flood.
Well, yes, and it does drain into Philippi Creek, but then they did dredge out, another little inlet or creek, in the middle of the neighborhood that did help with that flow. So naturally, just like everybody else, we're wondering, is this gonna happen again? Should we be worried about it? I mean, I'm terrified, but, we're trying to figure, I'm also on the board, so we're trying to figure out like ways to solve for.
Did you have water in your house?
Well, I set up, I'm on a 4-foot crawl space, so I did not get water in my house, but it filled the crawl space and I had to move out. We have to
Did
cut
other
everyone
people
else.
have water in their homes?
I think that there were a couple people in the neighborhood that did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so-
and we have condos that are in the front and they did too, so.
Yeah, that area is susceptible. It was built recently enough that it should have been built high enough. But again, if we're having rainfall events that are 30% more than what the infrastructure has been designed for, then water's gonna get higher.
So then what's the solution? Because we can't go, I got a letter from the county saying that if if the cost to rebuild my house was 50% or more of my assessed value, then I'd have to raise my house a foot. Because I am in a flood zone, but not everybody in the neighborhood's in a flood zone. So I'm just curious, like, what would the solution be? I mean, we can't raise our, homes. So is there we're just wondering if there's like a drainage issue around our neighborhood or, or maybe they're not cleaning like they should be cleaning the drains, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the first thing to make sure that the system's getting maintained. It's
But
real-
outside of our neighborhood too, though.
Pardon me?
Outside of our community, not just within, not just the.
Yeah, but
areas
you're
within.
paying for it. You're paying for that to be maintained. The county, by the way, the county does not maintain all these private drainage systems and ponds that people put in. That's the other thing. Those are all the community's responsibility. They're just responsible to maintain the ditches that those drain into. And those ditches have not changed in 20 years. They haven't gotten expanded or there's not more of them. So their obligation for maintenance hasn't really increased in the last 20 years. So that's what I'm saying. They should be able to do that and keep on it and make sure that
Within the
they-
community? I mean, within our community or the county?
If there's if they have an easement or right of way over that ditch, it's their obligation to do it.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that right? Because they've told us no.
Well,
We've been told that too. There's been a fight with some of them too.
yeah, I've heard this a lot, and I've heard that from other. Palmer Ranch has had the same issue with it. But I'm saying, if it's a public drainage system, the canals, the ditches that accept the water, those are public, and they're either in an easement or right of way, or the county should want to get them in one, because so many people are relying on that. You maintain your stormwater ponds, you deal with the algae, the erosion, and all that. The county has no obligation on that, okay? But they do have an obligation if there's an easement or right of way on those ditches. If that's, I'm not an attorney, I don't know what Susan would say, but I mean, that's the system. What are they collecting money to maintain? Yes, in the back. Yeah.
So if you actually believe that the county commissioners are listening and paying attention to what you put together for them, then I'm wondering why the day after Milton, we got an email, those of us who were on the email list, saying that there's going to be either a workshop, somebody help me out here, from the county, because they're looking at building in an area that is restricted and opening that up and changing the development plan
to accommodate more building. This was the day after building. And I went to my mother, I said, wow, are they trying to slip this in because nobody's paying attention because they're dealing with flooding? Yep. So be aware of that, because I don't think they're listening to you.
No, they're not.
No,
They're not. But I've talked to a number of commissioners or commissioners to be, and they are. So, listen, I'm just one person. You guys are a lot of people.
We've been trying.
I know, I keep trying. I'm telling you, this is an opportunity to effectuate some change.
Yes.
Something is gonna happen in January with the new commissioners and staff. Stormwater staff they did not push back on these recommendations. I went over them. So, I don't want to paint a rosy picture, but I wouldn't go through all this on my own time when I could be on the beach.
My concern, and I think a lot of our concerns would be that they're gonna go, oh, well, we're gonna give you a stormwater protection system, I don't remember what you called it. But we're still gonna build on all the floodplains. Because we're doing this with you, that gives us permission now to build in our marshlands, everywhere that's protected.
Okay, I'm getting the eye from Susan.
Well, Steve's gift tonight to us and to the whole community, taking his years of expertise and knowledge and donating it to the community, is just an incredible gift to all of us. And now what we need to do in return is do everything we can to support him and his recommendations, as well as the recommendations in the Debby petition that Nikki Meiswinder put together that also looks at pollution from wastewater overflows that was also a terrible consequence from Debby. And we need to keep pushing for a pause in development approvals. If you were down in Venice, right after Debby, and right after the multiple county staff getting up and presenting to the board the terrible consequences that happened from that storm, and then they still move forward and approve the Pat Neal, was it 3H Ranch? So that's a problem. And we have to keep working on it. And I think the recommendations Steve has put together are very straightforward. They're very simple. There are some that there will be pushback from the developers behind the scenes. And we have to stay on top of that. So this is an area that is going to require us all to continue to be involved so that we effectuate the benefits of the work that Steve has done. And his depth of knowledge, the board is gonna have a hard time turning away from that. They're gonna have a hard time not paying attention to this. But we have got to be there, stay knowledgeable, stay involved, show up at meetings, send emails, send letters, go talk to your commissioners. It will make a difference, but we all have to stay involved and stay committed. And it's a long slog, but as happened, we wouldn't have a stormwater environmental utility if there hadn't been a lot of people that showed up after those flooding incidents in the 90s. And I came to the county sort of in the middle of the environmental utility being created. And that's how I got to know Steve. We were both working on issues with stormwater. So the system is there. It's a good system. It's a good foundation. But clearly, it needs to be improved. It needs to be changed. Rob?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say, I'm part of the SCAN group also, that one of the things I think we really need to push as citizens is the fact that I know for those of you who have gone to county commission meetings, how many times do they hold it at a time frame or a date when nobody's here or no one can get off work to attend?
One purpose. Yeah.
So one of the things we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to get this whole system revamped to the point where if it's something that is a project that is important to the community, it's gonna be held at a time when the community can show up. Because without that, you know, you're gonna have that same scenario where, oh, you know, 15 people showed up and, oh, you know, what do I care about them? But if, for example, this entire group showed up for the whole scenario, I think we would have some changes made. So I think that's another thing that we need to be pushing forward on, is making sure that priority type issues are before the commission at a time when we all can be there to say what we want to say.
But we've had county commission meetings where it's so packed and so overflowed, they opened up another room for the overflow people, and we still got voted down.
No,
I do think we will, my hope, belief is that there is gonna be a change on the county commission.
One thing I'd like to make a point is, when you think of the Celery Fields, it wasn't planned to be a recreation area. But when you got that public to use that facility every day of the year, when anything attacks the Celery Fields, you have a mass of people. And I don't think the stormwater will do very well unless they have a recreation element to it. That was accidental, that wasn't planned. If you don't have a recreation element to it, you don't have public participation, and you don't have access to it, so you don't know what's going on. But when you have something like the Celery Fields with the major recreation component, you have activists.
Yeah, there's somebody back here that's had a question for quite a while.
Yes. It's mainly for the.
Can you speak up?
Yes, it's mainly for the gentleman who was explaining.
Okay, let him finish this conversation while people are leaving. I'm really, really serious that it's gonna take all of us staying involved. Showing up at SCAN meetings is great, it's informative, but we've all got to show up at county commission meetings. If you can't show up to the meeting, send them an email. Okay? And there's one more question. Thank you for coming.
November 7th, the county is going to have a workshop or a planning commission. The planning commission is going to be hearing about P.R. Horton's building 170 homes next to Celery Fields on Redwood Road. This is something that obviously is relevant of what we're talking about here. November 7th, planning commission, 5:30, 5 o'clock. It's in